Mainlander's perspective is that non-existence is better than existence. One of his most popular ideologies is nothingness over being. From my perspective, sometimes people will sleep just to avoid life, not expecting any extravagant dream or to be particularly happy while sleeping. In a sense, it's an antidote to living and all its properties, sort of like drinking in a way, and I believe that's one of the main contributing reasons as to why people drink in the first place. Being in a slumber of nothingness is not living, it's existing. Thus, you consciously choose nothingness over being. When you ask yourself nothingness over being, you're essentially asking yourself what I listed above as slumber over living in all its properties. Many people will consider sleep to be comparable with death from a non-religious point of view. Let's weigh a portion of this. You won't bear any guilt, struggle, disappointment, boredom, excitement, laugh, gratitude. Would you compromise your happiness? Why would you even need to be happy if there was no adversity? How would you be happy without adversity? People who desire suicide usually solely seek the abundance of nothingness suicide has to offer. They might continue to live their life anyways because it takes a certain dedication to really accept death. However, those people might still continue to replicate nothingness, not boredom, in their own lives, such as bed rotting, doing drugs, alcohol as we covered, scrolling through reels, or sleeping as close to always as they can. Anything that doesn't make them feel well. In my opinion, simultaneously, this being a way of revolting death actually encourages it. It makes said individuals feel a preference towards nothingness over being. So here's where life starts to feel like a cheat. What you do to depression becomes your reason and endorsement for depression. So do what you will with that information. I don't want to die. I want the pain, tiredness, confusion, and distortion to go away, to sleep forever. Not everyone that longs for nothingness thinks life is torturous, or totally torturous at the very least. To put it simply, to not want to die but not want to live. Another comment I saw in a different video which reads, I don't want to die, but I don't want to live either. I've always wanted to be a spectator. You don't exist, but you still get to watch and move around whenever you want. It's like reading a book. You're a spectator to the characters inside, just tagging along by their side without having to exist and experience the problems. I think that's what I turned into a real bad habit of daydreaming too often. Now I'm too lost in my own head and made my life miserable. I need something to nail me down to reality. My therapist describes me as a morbid ideation rather than suicidal ideation. A lot of the time people think it's the same thing. I don't want to hurt myself. I'm even scared of dying. There are just times when I'd rather not be an active participant in life. When I tell people everything feels grey, I wish I could stop existing. They hear everything feels black, I want to kill myself. They aren't the same. Black is intense. Everything feels bland. I don't want to die. I just want to sleep for the rest of my life. The worst thing is, both existence and non-existence is scary, said an anonymous person on YouTube. I find that this comment specifically really ties together Mainlander's point. When we talk about suicide, I guess you can really break it down to black and grey, as they mentioned. The black one is obvious, and then there's the grey one. The grey one can be seen as the I just want to sleep forever, as they also said, which is Mainlander's philosophy. That is in the case that to sleep is to be non-existent. But then again, we as humans cannot conceptualize non-existence. So when I talk about sleeping being comparable to non-existence, that's really as far as how much I can conceptualize go, and how a lot of people would perceive non-existence to be plain nothing. And this really makes you think, because in the idea that we were, alive for 13 billion years, and that when we die we'll be in the same state prior to being alive, like literally a day before you were born. The day before you were born would be non-existence, and we can't conceptualize, or we can't even romanticize the time when we were non-existent. As Immanuel Kant said, you can only enjoy the idea of non-existence while you're still existing. Bottom line, some people can see this as the sole embodiment of nothingness, if you want to challenge Immanuel Kant's philosophy. Altruistic suicide is an act of selflessness, like when the connection between two or more is too strong. A good example of this would be undergoing a fatal living organ donation to save someone dear to you, or soldiers fighting on the front lines to protect their country and family with no ulterior motive at the very cost of their life. Egotistic suicide is when the connection between two or more is too weak. It leads to a lack of community and isolation. Your need for social interaction will not be fulfilled, and as a result, your will to live will suffer the consequences, as we are social creatures, introverted or not. Anomic suicide occurs when societal norms are scrambled, leaving people feeling lost and without direction. This often happens in war-torn countries and/or genocide because it disrupts societal norms and relationships on an insane scale of which people may feel lost and purposeless or overwhelmed, leading to adversity and in the end suicide. Fatalistic suicide happens when a person feels trapped by excessive rules and regulations, leaving no sense of freedom or control over their life. Suicide like this can be common within a country like North Korea. And in cases like this, suicide might be seen as a way for the person to exert a form of freedom, as they were deprived of freedom all their life. And if others were to become aware of this, it could influence their view on suicide, depending on how they perceive it.
There's a thing called the Papageno effect, which shows that when we talk about suicide in a nuanced way, the rate of suicidal ideation goes down.
I think there was for a long time the sort of perception that if we talk about it, we give people ideas that then they will act on, and we know that to be false at this point.
Emile Cioran experienced chronic insomnia, and when Emile was very young, he said to his mother, "I wish I was never born," and to which his mother replied, "If I'd known you'd been so unhappy, I would have aborted you." This made the lunatic smile. Basically, he also wrote a book called The Troubles with Being Born. This guy hated his life so, and in said book he famously wrote the line, "It's not worth the bother of killing yourself, since you always kill yourself too late." Emil himself wrote that life is a state of non-suicide but true suicide. Also, not that this is so related or relevant to the topic, but I stole this information from Clark Ellison's video. Monster without a name, you cease to exist. And the main character killed everyone this one general loved, and there was nobody left to call him by his name, whose name actually I don't even know. In doing so, he ceased to exist. And so this had me thinking, when you die, you no longer have a name. It's always the body. We found the body. Where do we keep the body? It's never your name. I believe this genuinely holds some value truth to it. Albert Camus stated that there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether or not life is worth living amounts to answering the most fundamental question of philosophy.
Are the best parts of life really just finding momentary distractions to keep yourself busy so you don't think about the harsh realities of life for a second? I can ride roller coasters, meet new friends, and spend time with my family all day long. It doesn't change the fact that the sun is just going to explode, and all this was for nothing.
Albert Camus states that once individuals acknowledge absurdism, they have three choices. One, religion, which he considered to be philosophical suicide. Metaphysics rebellion, which is basically embracing life despite its meaninglessness, aka absurdism. Or three, straight suicide. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to nihilists, you can't use any system of purpose to persuade them away from suicide. Nihilism and atheism have some fundamental differences, so don't get them confused. Some people might commit suicide because they're conscious of the absurdity. Albert Camus once said himself that life will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Don't surrender to the absurdity, embrace it, which is also the core principle of absurdism. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was condemned by the gods to roll a boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down again and again and again. Every time he reached the top, he was forced to repeat this for eternity. Now, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Camus suggests that despite the absurdity, Sisyphus can find meaning and even happiness in his situation by embracing the absurdity of his existence. By accepting his fate and finding purpose in the act of pushing the boulder, Sisyphus can transcend his suffering and find a sense of fulfillment. Thus, even in the face of a meaningless, pointless, and endless struggle, one can find contentment and meaning by embracing the absurdity of life and finding purpose in the struggle itself. I hope I'm making this clear. Some will believe that we commit suicide because we're conscious of the absurdity of our world. Life will be lived all the better if it has no meaning. Don't surrender to the absurdity, embrace it. To force one to die is murder, to force another to live is torture. Just to put into perspective, a lot of US veterans chose suicide over torture by the Vietnamese, and I don't think they have to be questioned for this for obvious reasons. Now, supposedly how it would go is that if they were to be captured or thought they were truly going to be captured, they commit suicide. Some people see suicide for the purpose of suicide as selfish, and they quote, "Suicide doesn't take away the pain, it gives it to the ones who love you," or "Did he even think about how his family and friends would feel?" In some aspects, it's really like saying, "I don't care that he was in so much pain that he'd rather not exist anymore. How could he be such an inconvenience to my happiness?" And bottom line, it's so depressingly ironic because it fits like a shoe with what I mentioned earlier. To force one to die is murder, to force another to live is torture. Now, there can be exceptions. I've been in the position of having to physically hold someone dear to me from jumping off, or like going back to since I was 8. And these attempts were in moment of very much clouded judgment due to certain substances and temporary conflict. It eradicates the question of rationality. Basically, my point is, having witnessed the impact of suicide firsthand, I'm not speaking out of ignorance when I say that it's literally this simple. Don't make suicide a question of selfishness, which I've seen people do. That's no way, shape, or form me saying don't be hysterical or upset by it, but it's simply unfair to make someone's self-inflicted death about you. This is a very easy concept to grasp, honestly. And it's interesting that we see suicide as self-harm when, in the perspective of the desperately tormented, it's a cure. And as hard as that may be to believe, if we indefinitely knew what comes after death, would suicide be looked at as such a depressing approach to life? One user said, and I quote, "The world is so cruel, it won't let you live and it won't let you die. It's very hard to be here on this planet. Brutal for some. I just don't get how life is worth it." The freedom we have isn't really freedom, like we're forced to stay on this planet, so people will tell themselves that suffering is a part of life as a coping mechanism. Like it's a spectrum. So many people want to die but don't. So many prisoners want to escape but don't, because they don't want to deal with lawful consequences. Life is a prison, suicide is freedom. Schopenhauer's concept of the will is our human drive, the underlying force that shapes our lives, often leading to suffering, unfortunately, because it's never fully satisfied. The will is an endless striving for goals that, once achieved, only leads to more desires. This constant striving for inability to attain lasting satisfaction can lead to a full cycle of suffering. It's like a hamster wheel if you think about it. Even with this in mind, suicide doesn't fully reject the will. Now, the will can be revolted, and I quote, "Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills." And in that sense, we are in fact prisoners, as Schopenhauer stated. Now, suicide is merely a stop to the will, which is more than anything else can offer, really. The more we understand, the less we are scared of the unknown, more than anything. To say, yeah, whatever comes afterwards, hell, heaven, nothingness, fairy tale, or whatever is better than all I know and the whole of my existence is really one hell of a gamble, I have to say. Also, a quick quote I really like by Dostoevsky: "The best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows he's in a prison." Rational suicide is the idea that an individual can rationally make the decision to end their life.
Sometimes it's rationally acceptable to do something, but it's immoral.
Suicide could, and keyword could, be rational if someone's life is really only going to get worse moving forward, not just from like a pessimistic perspective. Example, if someone is terminally ill, they have like a grocery list of illnesses, issues, and this and that, or they're quite old and believe it's not worth it to go through with all these tests and treatments, or that they just simply want to end or prevent the pain that comes with their sickness or treatment. In that very specific case, many people will consider it rational. Signing a DNR can be an example too. Also, Many people unintentionally don't even call it suicide. In cases like this, it's actually known as assisted suicide. Now, let's talk about what's not rational. Suicide is not rational if someone is simply going through a difficult time. We can't know for sure that flu is only temporary, until it's pneumonia, which makes it widely a gamble to use as an argument. To say like, well, pack it up, life is not worth living anymore. The bad really has to outweigh the good, but there's no definite scale. It's beyond calculation or measurement. We would need to be able to compare their current state to a possible future state in which they're dead. However, there's no future state to compare to, since it's the end of all we know. Therefore, there's really no answers to the question of rationalism and suicide. It's not essential. That can be really frustrating for many people to grasp because it's not a direct answer. But you can hear what someone who've attempted to commit suicide has to say about rationalism and suicide, which is far better than anything I can say.
Suicidality is not rational. It's not something that you can make logic out of or make sense out of. People who kill themselves are ill, they need help. They don't do it just for fun.
Stoics also believe strongly in the individual right to choose the way and time of their death. This can also be viewed as rational if you're gonna die in a burning building, which would be very painful. You commit suicide to prevent going through that, painful way of dying. In which suicide is considered rational if you can confirm that you're gonna die in a burning building, but you can't, like I said. To suppress or prevent pain unworthy is considered rational, same like assisted suicide. If you were to be ran over by a semi-truck, just roll with these examples, but committed suicide to prevent the unnecessary painful way of going out, that would possibly fit the rational description. But you can't know for sure, once again. But you also can't know for sure that you wouldn't be ran over by a semi-truck in the next 12 minutes unless you live in a building. So it's not exactly a conscious decision, which completely disregards the definition of rationality. Margaret Batten defends the idea that suicide can in fact be rational and a morally permissible choice, especially in cases like terminal illness. She argues that individuals should have, the right to decide whether or not how they end their life. Same like how the Stoics believe. Now, to bring in logistics really, 90 to 95% of people who die by suicide have some form of diagnosable mental illness. And with this in mind, it begs the question of how is the rationality of suicide affected by mental disorders? Now, keep in mind, someone with a mental disorder in certain situations can, of course, make rational choices just like anybody else. Without a mental disorder, they may not be able to make rational choices all the time for every scenario. But my point is that not all irrationality that occurs from a person with a mental disorder stems from their disorder, full stop. It could very well stem from, simply being human. With mental disorders, especially like depression or bipolar disorder or BPD, they can in fact have their judgment clouded when making decisions to commit suicide. While OCD, for example, even though can be extremely distressing, typically doesn't mean it's going to be the sole reason for suicide, especially moderate to little OCD. Just because someone has moderate OCD, that doesn't dictate their decision to commit suicide and shouldn't be labeled as irrational due to being a mental illness without knowing whether or not it was managed or how severe it was. Same goes for almost a lot of mental disorders in this specific situation. Now, like I mentioned, our natural drive is to have a goal. When we're deprived of that drive, it breaks our world. 40% of suicides have been caused by the grief of a loved one, possibly resulting in a loss of interest or purpose or achieving said goal, which in return can be the reason or one of the many reasons for suicide. if I recall properly, 90% of suicide survivors are glad they didn't die. Like, even years down the line, they're glad they didn't. That's why science supports the idea that prevention of suicide makes sense. The morality of an action is determined by its consequences by definition. So from this perspective, suicide could be seen as morally wrong in some cases because, it would cause pain to the people who loved you. However, if the person is better off dead, then their suicide could be seen as morally okay to some. And I'm not going to give any examples because, obviously, but you can decide for yourself how you feel about this. But to sum it up, there's no easygoing answer to whether or not suicide is morally okay. When we talk about suicide morality, it shouldn't be a fundamental part of the discussion, since there's obviously much bigger issues to talk about when it comes to the topic of suicide rather than the morality of it. Although it does provide some interesting discussions, definitely. Although some will say that suicide is always morally wrong because it's, a violation of our right to life, which should be used to describe murder actually rather than, being the same reason Stoics believed in the right of suicide.
Honest with how I felt in the past, especially since there's been so many firefighter suicides.
All the people that I personally know that committed suicide were men, and I know one woman that attempted but wasn't successful. Why is that really? Now, statistically, it's been proven that men use more lethal methods when attempting. Like, men statistically will shoot themselves directly in the head in the name of suicide far more than women. Whether this is a question of availability or grit when it comes to the question of suicide can be further looked into, but honestly I'm not educated enough to give opinions presented as facts. Overall, methods like this can almost certainly guarantee suicide far more than swallowing a bottle of pills, because in some rare cases medics are able to save people from overdoses. Out of the 703,000 suicides that happen per year, which is, by the way, completely insane, of that 777% are men, so around 540,000 men a year and around 160,000 women a year. This means for every 1 woman, 3 to 4 men commit suicide. And I've been trying to research this to properly get a grasp of the situation rather than, presenting opinions as facts when it comes to something as, delicate as this. From, what I've been able to research, I've found some, pretty relevant statistics here. Men make up 90% of US veterans. Men also make up 85 to 90% of first responders. And when you really take into account that 90% of veteran suicides and 88% of first responder suicides are men, you can kind of see why the statistics are the way they are. Men dominate the professions where suicide risk is stupidly high. When they commit suicide, it contributes to the statistical rate of male suicide given the percentage of men to women ratio in these fields. And overall, the belief that, being vulnerable is a sign of weakness definitely, contributes to the ratio, which is really unfair and should be more funded, because 1 in 3,000 is just absurd. It shouldn't be something that people look over, School funding is important, but I believe that something like this is as important. Now, when we review our earlier statistics, you see that 80 to 90% of those said first responders, 1 out of 4,000 to 8,000 of them committed suicide. And out of the 90% of US veterans, 1 out of 3,000 commit suicide. Do you know how crazy that is? It's mad. It's genuinely mad. That's all I can say. Okay, I just wanted to end this off on a very clear note here that someone who's suicidal doesn't give 2 quarters about what Durkheim has to say about the 4 typologies. Reach out for actual help. matter how much I check, no matter how much no answers, nothing. Oh my God, there is nothing. Basically, it just goes back to, oh, it depends on the situation. And it's really frustrating because I wanted to understand this so badly. I wanted to understand it, and I've poured hours and hours. I have Google Docs going back to when I was 13, 2 years ago. And I just can't get past the skin of the apple. Like, I'm very unsatisfied with the research I was able to conduct